workers renovating a shop in England uncovered a secret cache of World War II bills worth $1.3 million. The building that houses the Cotswold outdoor chain store in the southern English city of Brighton is believed to have a long and prestigious history. Indeed, it is thought to have once been a tailor to the stars. But that doesn't mean the renovators were expecting to find a long-buried fortune hidden deep under its floorboards. During the 1930s, the threat of war hung over Europe. People didn't want it. The brutal memories of World War I were still fresh in their minds. But as the Nazis continued to ruthlessly expand throughout the continent, the threat of conflict grew. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, in response to the latter's invasion of Poland. The main conflict, however, took a while to get going, and the first few months became known as the Phony War, as a stalemate developed in Western Europe. So France and Britain built up their land forces, and the Allies instituted a naval blockade around Germany. Britain also adopted new defensive procedures in case of a German air attack on its mainland. Darkness fell on Britain 2 days before the war began, and lasted until 1945. Street lamps were switched off, car headlights were covered and special curtains were hung in domestic homes, with brown paper fastened around the edges to block light. Meanwhile, Britain had taken measures in the months before the war to try and strengthen its military. In numbers, however, its nearly 900,000 men were far below the 5 million France had mustered. So a new law was passed introducing conscription for all able-bodied men between 18 and 41. Within 3 days of the German invasion of Poland, 1.5 million British children had been evacuated from the cities and towns that were considered likely targets of Nazi bombing. However, as the phony war continued with no major attacks, many children returned home. But when Germany invaded France in May 1940 and Britain became a target of bombings, many were evacuated yet again, staying away until the conflict ended. Then in June 1940 food rationing began, and every man, woman, and child was issued a ration book. This would contain coupons to be used for buying even basic food products such as cheese, sugar, and meat. But there were exceptions in the rationing system. Vulnerable groups such as children and pregnant women were prioritized for products such as milk and eggs. For their part, fresh fruit and vegetables weren't rationed, but availability was still limited. And it wasn't just food that was in short supply. Petrol was rationed even before edibles, in 1939. It was followed by clothes rationing in 1941, then soap in 1942. The textile industry was under huge pressure because of the need to produce uniforms not just for the growing army, but for various other organizations that supported the war effort. Indeed, clothes rationing was a way to conserve limited supplies and ensure what existed was fairly distributed. Different items of clothing were awarded a points value depending on the effort involved in its production. And for their part, children were allowed extra clothing coupons to allow for growth spurts. But rationing didn't stop people from dressing their best, and they were encouraged to do so to keep up morale. Indeed, Britons became creative with how they made and repaired their own clothes. Parachute silk was a popular material in underwear, wedding dresses, and night clothes. Meanwhile, the phony war came to an end in May 1940, when Germany invaded Western Europe. May also saw Winston Churchill become the new British Prime Minister. Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born in Oxfordshire in 1874. His father's family traced back to the first Duke of Marlborough, who had won his renown in the early 1700s during British conflicts with the French. In 1908 Churchill married Clementine Hosier, and the couple remained together until the former's death 56 years later. She was also from an aristocratic family, though she had grown up poor. They would have 5 children together, and Hosier would offer vital support to her husband even at his lowest points. Churchill began his career in the army, before entering politics in 1899. And his parliamentary career saw him switch sides between the Conservative and Liberal parties and then back again. Meanwhile, Churchill continuously warned of the dangers of Hitler in the 1930s. But it wasn't until the policy of appeasement practiced by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain failed miserably that Parliament looked for a leader who could unite and inspire the country in its darkest hour. But what does Winston Churchill have to do with the money found beneath the floor in the store in Brighton? Well, a favoured tailor of Churchill and his wife was called Bradley's, and Bradley Gowns, believed to be a branch of the company, was based in the seaside city. In 2018, the owner of the Cotswold outdoor store, Russ Davis, was doing renovation works on the building. He tore up the rotten carpet, broken tiles and ancient floorboards, and there was a lot to lift, suggesting it had been there a long time. It was hard to make out details because the block was stuck together, but Davis soon identified a £1 bill, which haven't been used in Britain since 1988. Even rarer, the bill was blue, rather than the usual green. Blue was the colour chosen by the Bank of England for its emergency currency in 1941. During the war, the Germans had a plan that they called Operation Bernhardt. It was an attempt to forge and distribute the British £5 bill to destabilise the economy. As the design and security measures used in British currency hadn't changed in nearly a century, they were easy to copy. So the Bank of England had to step up security, and in 1941 they created the emergency £1 bill. Blue in color and containing a metallic thread, it was a breakthrough in design. 2 years later, bills higher than £5 were withdrawn from public circulation altogether to prevent them being forged. Meanwhile, Cotswold outdoor store owner Russ Davis soon realized that there was much more than one World War II bill under his shop. Indeed, he found around 30 bundles of £1 and £5, each worth around $1,300 each. In modern terms, the £30,000 worth of bills are valued at more than £1 million, or nearly $1.3 million. But it's a mystery how so much money ended up under the floor. Davis told the BBC that though the money could have come from a bank robbery, or been stashed during the war by someone who died. For its part, Bradley Gowns operated the Brighton site between 1936 and 1973. And, as previously mentioned, the shop was believed to be a subsidiary of Bradley's. This was the company credited for creating the guinea gown for people who could not afford more expensive clothing, but still wanted to look smart. Samuel Bradley Sr. founded the first Bradley's store in the 1860s, in Chepstow Place, London, and it primarily stocked ladies' furs. The name changed in 1896 to become Bradley & Sons Arctic Fur Store, the again in 1912 when it became just Bradley's. During World War I, Bradley's helped make uniforms for the troops. And in the 1920s it expanded to have around 600 staff, including its own fashion designers. And its popular coats came with a hefty price tag, costing over $100,000 in today's money. Meanwhile, Bernard Bradley's family became heavily involved in World War II. He had 2 sons, Eric and Victor, and the former turned 18 on September 3, 1939, the day that war was declared. Eric joined the Royal Air Force, while his brother served as a pilot, and neither returned home until 1944. Meanwhile, shortly after the Bradley brothers went to war, things started looking bad for the Allies. British, French, and Belgian troops had to try and escape from the French port of Dunkirk as the Germans had them surrounded. Alone against the Nazis, Britain felt the full weight of the German assault. And as the summer of 1940 began, the skies became full of dueling aircraft as the Battle of Britain began. Fearsome skirmishes ensued in the air, which saw Britain eventually victorious that October. Sadly, the Bradley house was one of many family homes destroyed during the war. Howard Bradley, the only heir of the family, told the Argus in 2018, "My grandmother even had to be rescued from under a pile of rubble after a German V-1 rocket hit the building she was in." During the German bombing campaign over Britain, banks were often attacked. So a clothes shop in a smaller city like Brighton would serve as a less likely target. Maybe the Bradleys had owned that money, and had decided that burying it under the floorboards was the best way to preserve their cash? After all, that secret stash could have become a form of protection for them, their family and friends if a potential Nazi invasion was successful. Meanwhile, like many other textile firms, the Bradleys had to cope with clothes rationing. Then, as well as the house, the Bradleys' hat-making facilities were destroyed by bombs. The guinea gown may have been invented by Bernard Bradley, but he had failed to patent it. After Bernard Bradley died, the business transformed again, this time into the realms of dry cleaning and repair. A dry cleaner in Milton Keynes, 115 miles from Brighton, is the last outpost of the Bradley family and is run by Eric's son, Howard Bradley. However, Howard Bradley isn't even completely sure that Bradley Gowns was part of the wider Bradley network. And he doesn't know for certain why the money was buried, or who owned it in the first place, adding that there are no family legends about the money. However, the theory of Howard Bradley owning the money and stashing it still doesn't explain why no one returned for it after the war. Theoretically, if someone took it to the Bank of England, it could be exchanged for modern bills and make its owner a millionaire. Elsewhere, Churchill himself now appears on the £5 note, which began circulation in 2016. He joins Jane Austen on the orange-brown £10, economist Adam Smith on the purple £20, and Matthew Boulton and James Watt, key figures of the Industrial Revolution, on the red £50 note. Meanwhile, 2018 saw a number of other stories about valuable currencies hit the headlines. For example, in August that year, a rare coin, one of only 5 produced and known as the Eliasberg 1913 Liberty Head nickel, sold for $4.5 million at a Philadelphia auction.